Good morning, children, and welcome back to the class of English. Today, we are going to discuss the rest part of the chapter, The Silk Road by Nick Middleton. Children, in the previous video, I have told you about the journey of Nick Middleton towards Mount Kailash. He studied from Ravu to Mount Kailash to do the Khora. In Ravu, he was offered a sheepskin coat by the local resident lady, Lama. And then he crossed mountain passes, nomadic tents. Near the nomadic tents, he was greeted by Tibetan mastiffs who barked at them. Then he crossed two mountain blocks with great difficulty, and finally he reached the town of Hor. From there, the Daniel found a ride in a truck to return to Lhasa because he could not accompany them. Seaton repaired his two tire punctures. And actually, the Hor was a very grim and miserable place because there was no vegetation, only just dust and rocks. Tibet's most venerated stretch of water, ancient Hindu and Buddhist cosmology pinpoints Mansoor as the source of four great Indian rivers: the Indus, the Ganges, the Satluj, and the Brahmaputra. Actually, only the Satluj flows from the lake, but the headwaters of the others all rise nearby on the flanks of Mount Kailash. We were within striking distance of the great mountain, and I was eager to forge ahead, but I had to wait. Seaton told me to go and drink some tea in Hort's only cafe, which, like all the other buildings in towns, was constructed from badly painted concrete and had three broken windows. The good view of the lake through one of them helped to compensate for the drought. I was served by a Chinese youth in military uniform who spread the grease around my table and with a filthy rag before bringing me a glass and a thermos of tea. The children hall was a very, miserable place. Actually, they had tea in Hor's only one cafe which was there. They left Hor after half an hour and they drove past rocks and rubbish westwards towards Mount Kailash. And the Lake Mansoor is considered as the source of the four great Indian rivers. Means the four great Indian rivers: Ganges, Satluj, Brahmaputra, Indus, Ganges, Satluj, and Brahmaputra. They get water from Lake Mansoor. In the cafe where Seaton got tea, a Chinese youth, which was in military uniform, he immediately cleaned the table. But actually, his rag was so filthy or dirty that instead of cleaning, he spread the grease around the table, which was very funny for the author. And he brought a glass and a thermos of tea. Half an hour later, Seaton relieved me from my solitary confinement, and we drove past a lot more rocks and rubbish westwards out of town towards Mount Kailash. My experience in Hor came as a stark contrast to accounts I had read of earlier travelers' first encounters with Lake Mansoor. Ikai Kawaguchi, a Japanese monk who had arrived there in 1900, was so moved by the sanctity of the lake that he burst into tears. A couple of years later, the hallowed waters had a similar effect on Svein Hedin, a Swede. Swede means Swedish, a resident of Sweden, who wasn't prone to sentimental outburst. It was dark by the time we finally left again, and after 10:30 p.m., we drew up outside a guest house in Darchen for what turned out to be another troubled night. Kicking around in the open air rubbish dump that passed for the town of Hor had set off my cold once more, though, if truth be told, it had never quite disappeared with my herbal tea. One of my nostrils was blocked again, and as I lay down to sleep, I wasn't convinced that the other would provide me with sufficient oxygen. My watch told me that I was at 4,760 meters. It wasn't much higher than Ravu, and there I had been gasping for oxygen several times every night. I had grown accustomed to these nocturnal disturbances by now, but they still scared me. So, children, they The author and Seaton again then moved towards Mount Kailash. And then, Nick Milton gives an account of a traveler named Ikai Kawaguchi, who was a Japanese monk, and Swain Hayden, who was a Swedish. They actually, I just told in the previous video that I will tell about the experience of some travelers, those who were there in the mount near in front of the Mount class. So Ikai Kawaguchi and Swain Hayden had been described over here. So Ikai Kawaguchi was so moved by the sanctity. Sanctity means purity of the lake that he burst into tears. Means he started weeping. And Swain Hayden, he couldn't also not control his sentimental bursts. After 10:30 p.m., they drew up outside a guest house in Darchin. One of the narrator's nostrils was again blocked, as he was tired and hungry. I started breathing through my mouth. After a while, I switched to single nostril power, which seemed to be admitting enough oxygen, but just as I was drifting off, I woke up abruptly. Something was wrong. So, author was at the height of 4,760 meters, and it was not much higher as compared to Rao, but again, the same problem he had started again. And it was again a trouble night for Nick Middleton. And he was tired and hungry, and he was gasping for breath also. He could feel better when he sat up, and then he could breathe freely. So he stayed awakened all night. My chest felt strangely heavy, and I set up a movement that cleared my nasal passages almost instantly and relieved the feeling in my chest. Curious, I thought. I lay back down and tired again. Same result, I was on the point of disappearing into the land of Nod when something told me not to it. It must have been those emergency electrical impulses again, but this was not the same as on previous occasions. This time, I wasn't gasping for breath. I was simply not allowed to go to sleep. Sitting up once more immediately made me feel better. I could breathe freely and my chest felt fine. But as soon as I lay down, my sinuses filled with my chest. Was odd. I tried propping myself upright against the wall, but I couldn't manage to relax enough to drop off. I couldn't put my finger on the reason, but I was afraid to go to sleep. A dull voice inside me was saying that if I did, I might never wake up again. So I stayed awake all night. Children, here the author is describing about his altitude sickness, that he was not able to breathe properly. His nostrils got blocked, and with one nostril he was not able to breathe properly. Means his sinuses filled up and his chest was not feeling good. Then whole night he had to pass awaken. Seaton took me to Darchin Medical College the following morning. The medical college at Darchin was new and looked like a monastery from the outside, with a very solid door that led into a large courtyard. We found the consulting room, which was dark and cold and occupied by the Tibetan doctor, who wore none of the paraphernalia that I had been expecting. No white coat, he looked like any other Tibetan with a thick pullover and a woolly hat. When I explained my sleepless symptoms and my sudden aversion to lying down, he shot me a few questions while feeling the veins in my wrist. It's a cold, he said finally through Seaton. A cold and the effects of altitude. I'll give you something for it. I asked him if he thought I'd recover enough to be able to do the Kora. Oh, yes, he said, you'll be fine. I walked to the medical college, clutching a brown envelope stuffed with 15 screws of paper. I had a 5-day course of Tibetan medicine, which I started right away. I opened an after breakfast package and found it contained a brown powder that I had to take with hot water. It tasted just like cinnamon. The contents of the lunchtime and the bedtime packages were less obviously identifiable. Both contained small spherical brown pellets. They looked suspiciously like sheep dung, but of course I took them. That night, after my first full day's course, I slept very soundly, like a log, not a dead man. So the next morning, children, Seaton took Nick to the Darchin Medical College. The doctor there felt the narrator's pulse, asked some questions, and gave him medicines for cold and exhaustion due to altitude. And the tablets which were given by the doctor, they appear to the narrator as sheep dung because they belong to Ayurvedic medicine. So that night when narrator took the medicine, he slept soundly at night after the full day's course of medicine. And he slept like a log, not a dead man. Once he saw that I was going to live, Satan left me to return to Lhasa. As a Buddhist, he told me he knew that it didn't really matter if I passed away, but he thought it would be bad for business. Darchen didn't look so horrible after a good night's sleep. It was still dusty, partially derelict, and punctuated by heaps of rubble and refuse. But the sun shone brilliantly in a clear blue sky, and the outlook across the plain to the south gave me a vision of the Himalayas, commanded by a huge snow-capped mountain, Gulla Mandhata, with just a wisp of cloud suspended over its summit. The town had a couple of rudimentary general stores selling Chinese cigarettes, soap, and other basic provisions, as well as the usual strings of prayer flags. In front of one, men gathered in the afternoon for a game of pool. The battered table looking supremely incongruous in the open air, while nearby women washed their long hair in the icy water of a narrow brook that babbled down past my guest house. Darchin felt relaxed and unhurried, but for me, it came with a significant drawback. There were no pilgrims. So once Neta recovered, Seaton left him, and he returned to Lhasa. As a Buddhist, Seaton, made a joke or what to say, what it was. But actually, he said that it doesn't matter to Seaton whether author would die there, but it would be bad for business. I think it was a kind of a joke. So at Darchin, it was not so horrible because author had already taken the medicine, he had recovered, and he could sleep easily. At Darchin had some simple general stores selling Chinese cigarettes, soaps, and supplies of food. And men, they gathered for a game of pool in front of a general store, and women, they washed their long hair in the icy water of a narrow brook near the guest house. There were no pilgrims, and Darjan had only one cafe. I had been told at the height of the pilgrimage season the town was bustling with visitors. Many brought their own accommodation, enlarging the settlement around its edges as they set up their tents, which spilled down on the plain. I had timed my arrival for the beginning of the season, but it seemed I was too early. One afternoon, I sat pondering my options over a glass of tea in Darjan's only cafe, and after a little consideration, I concluded that they were severely limited. Clearly, I hadn't made much progress with my self help program on positive thinking. In my defense, it hadn't been easy with all my sleeping difficulties, but however I looked at it, I could only wait. The pilgrimage trail was well trodden, but it didn't fancy doing it alone. The Kora was seasonal because parts of the routes were liable to blockage by snow. I had no idea whether or not the snow had cleared, but I wasn't encouraged by the chunks of dirty ice that still clung to the bank of Darchen's brook. Since Seaton had left, I hadn't come across anyone in Darchen with enough English to answer even this most basic question. So at Darchen there were no more pilgrims, but he was told that when there is pilgrimage season, the town gets bustled with pilgrims. And then what happened? Seaton had already left, and now author didn't find anyone who could speak English nicely at that place. Until that, as I met Norbu. The cafe was small, dark, and cavernous, with a long metal stove that ran down the middle. The walls and ceilings were wreathing in sheets of multicolored plastic of the stripped variety. Broad blue, red, and white that is made into stout, voluminous shopping bags sold over all China and in many countries of Asia as well as Europe. As such, plastic must rate as one of China's most successful exports along the Silk Road today. The cafe had a single window beside which I had taken up position so that I could see the pages of my notebook. I had also brought a novel with me to help pass the time. Norbu saw my book when he came in and asked with a gesture if he could sit opposite me at my rickety table. You English? He inquired after he had ordered tea. I told him I was, and we struck up a conversation. The children, Daniel had left for Lhasa, Seaton has also left for Lhasa. But what happened? In Darchin, there was only one cafe, and it was very dark, like a cave, and empty. There, Middleton met Norbu, and Norbu came to him and asked Nick whether he knew English, and then they started their conversation. I didn't think he was from those parts because he was wearing a wind shitter and metal rimmed spectacles of a Western style. He was a Tibetan, he told me, but worked in Beijing at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in the Institute of Ethnic Literature. I assumed he was on some sort of field work. Yes and no, he said. I have come to do the Kora. My heart jumped. Norbu had been writing academic papers about the Kailash Kora and its importance in various works of Buddhist literature for many years, he told me, but he had never actually done it himself. When the time came for me to tell him that what brought me to Darjin, his eyes lit up. We could be a team, he said excitedly. Two academics who have escaped from the library. Perhaps my positive thinking strategy was working after all. The children, the author met Norbu in the only cafe of Darchin. And Norbu was a Tibetan and he worked in Beijing, at Beijing in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in the Institute of Ethnic Literature. But he could speak English and he too had come to do Kora. Norbu was very fat. And now when author told him that I have also come here to do the Kora, it was nice. And then Norbu became happy and he said that we could be a team. My initial relief at meeting Norbu, who was staying in the guest house, was tempered by the realization that he was almost as ill equipped as I was for the pilgrimage. He kept telling me how fat he was and how hard it was going to be. Very high up, he kept reminding me. So tiresome to walk. He wasn't really a practicing Buddhist, it transpired, but he had enthusiasm and he was, of course, Tibetan. Although I had originally envisaged making the track in the company of devout believers, on reflection, I decided that perhaps Norbu would turn out to be the ideal companion. He suggested we hire some yaks to carry our luggage, which I interpreted as a good sign, and he had no intention of prostrating himself all round the mountain. Not possible, he cried, collapsing across the table in hysterical laughter. It wasn't his style, and anyway, his tummy was too big. The children, Norbu was a Tibetan, and he worked in the Chinese Academy of Social Science in Beijing, in the Institute of Ethnic Literature. He could speak English, and he too had come to do the Kora. Norbu was very fat, and he found it very hard and tiresome to walk or go up. And he wasn't really a practicing Buddhist, but he had enthusiasm, and he was a Tibetan. So the narrator decided to make the track in the company of Norbu, because generally we say ek aur ek 11, and it is, children, two persons can equalize to 11, because when you are on a very dangerous path, then a single helper can make you come out of that danger. Now, the narrator decided to make the track in company of Norbu instead of waiting for the devout believers. And they hired yaks to carry their luggage, Norbu said that they had no intention of prostrating himself all down the mountains. It was not possible for him, as his tummy was too big, because Norbu was fat, and he laughed in a extremely funny way while saying so. So Norbu was a funny person for Nick Middleton. And children, in this way, Nick Middleton got a company to do the core of Mount Kailash. So children, that's all about this chapter. I hope you have understood the chapter from the explanation being provided in the three videos. The children, hoping for the positive result and waiting for the questions from your side. Till then, thank you and goodbye.